Good morning, everyone. Two cousins, Penelope Jasko and Eleanor McBride, who both lived here in the Miami Valley, were 6 years old and nearly inseparable, we're told. Described as more like twin sisters than cousins, the two were together on August 26, 2019. Director, thank you. On that day, they played soccer and then piled into a van with family members to return a book to the Dayton Public Library on South Patterson. At the same time, a man was on a crime spree. He stabbed his father, stole his father's car, and crashed it. When an officer stopped to help, he stole the officer's cruiser and sped away, headed right towards the library. That man crashed the stolen cruiser into the van that Eleanor and her cousin and their family were in. It also happened moments after they'd returned their book. Those two innocent, inseparable young cousins were killed, and several others were hurt. Now, I'm talking about this case because the man accused of killing the girls, Raymond Walters, had just been released from prison 16 days before. He was on what is called post-release control and under the supervision of the Adult Parole Authority, the APA, which is a division of the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections. Now, let me be clear, post-release control is not parole. Offenders who are eligible for parole can be released by the parole board if they've been rehabilitated in prison. And that's a decision by the parole board. But more than 20 years ago, the law changed in Ohio to require definite sentences in most cases. Offenders sentenced under this law are released no matter how they behave in prison, and no matter if they are still a risk to the public. This is where post-release control comes in, and why it's so important. After leaving prison, many offenders, primarily those who commit acts of violence or sex offenses, are required to regularly report to an APA parole officer as part of their post-release control. It's the job of the APA to make sure offenders stay clean, follow their post-release control conditions, and live crime-free lives. When offenders are released from prison under the supervision of the state, the number one obligation must be to ensure that we keep our citizens safe. And although an investigation into the supervision of Raymond Walters found that his parole officer did follow APA procedures and policies, I have concerns and had concerns that those policies simply were not strong enough. Concerns over APA supervision have been raised in recent years, and some changes have been made, including the passage of the Reagan-Tokes Act, which allowed for some indefinite sentences. But a comprehensive review of all APA policies and practices had not been done. In October, I ordered that such a review take place. I formed in October our working group on post-release control, chaired by the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections Director Annette Chambers-Smith and former Director Reggie Wilkinson, both who are here today. And I charged them with conducting an in-depth examination of the overall workings of the APA. Today, I'm here with working group members to announce the results of their study, as well as the actions I'm ordering in response. And this is the report, Director, if I could hold that up. This is the report that they issued. And let me just say before I go on with my prepared remarks, it is the commitment of this administration and of the department that this will become the Bible, and that they will follow this and do everything they can to implement this. Some things they've already started. Some things are done. Some things it will take a much longer period of time to implement. Some will depend on the next year's budget and getting the appropriate money. But this is what they will follow, because the safety of the public must be the most important thing that we do. Next, Director. The group returned a total of 11 recommendations in their initial report. That report we're releasing today. Let's start with caseload for the officers. We've known for some time that APA officers are overwhelmed with too many offenders to supervise and not enough time to do it. The average APA officer caseload is 76 to 1, but some are supervising over 100 offenders each, including some placed on probation by the local courts. These caseloads are simply much, much too high, and frankly, they are dangerous to the public. They're dangerous for the parole officers, and they're dangerous for the members of the public who depend on the APA to effectively monitor these former inmates. As part of the biennium budget that I signed last July, I worked to address this issue by securing funding from the General Assembly, and I want to thank them for those funds, to increase APA staffing by 40 individuals, most of whom are new parole officer positions. We also secured resources that we're directing to local probation departments around the state to help them supervise more of their own offenders. This allowed the APA to free up around 60 parole officers to focus exclusively on offenders released from prison. At the end of the biennium, we expect the average caseload to drop to 60 to 1. That's a step in the right direction, but it's not good enough. This working group recommends that we continue to reduce caseloads, and I wholeheartedly agree. Today I'm announcing that I have directed the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections and the APA to drop caseloads to 50 to 1 for general caseloads and 40 to 1 for specialized caseloads, such as those that consist only of sex offenders or ex-inmates suffering from mental illness. In other words, the most dangerous individuals. The ratio must be lower, and we must have parole officers who focus on those and who are experienced. To get to this goal, I'm committing right now that we will go back to the General Assembly to secure more funding for more staff in the next operating budget. I'm doing this because the safety and security of the public demands that Ohio invest in the adequate supervision of dangerous former inmates. In the meantime, I've asked the APA to develop a new workload-based approach to assigning cases to parole officers. Staff resources should be focused on the most dangerous offenders, and the most experienced officers should be assigned to the highest risk offenders. The APA will also begin to assign more parole officers to specialized caseloads, so these populations have focused supervision from specially trained officers. Next, another issue the working group looked at is the use of GPS monitoring. And let me talk now about GPS monitoring. If it is used properly, it can be an effective tool for supervising certain former inmates. Now, the average citizen in Ohio would assume that when someone is under GPS monitoring, and when they violate the conditions of that monitoring, people would assume that an APA officer would immediately look to hold that person accountable. However, the working group found that's not always the case. In fact, if an offender commits a violation at night or on the weekend, the APA does not address it until next business day. This is ineffective and frankly dangerous, and it must cease. Criminals don't only operate Monday through Friday from 8 to 5, so we must ensure that our post-release control system instantly reacts when an offender violates the terms of their electronic monitoring. And let me now talk about that and how we need to achieve that. I've called on the Ohio Department of Public Safety to collaborate with the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and the APA to jointly develop a plan to work together to address GPS violations right away, no matter what day of the week or what time of day. Now, the Department of Public Safety has analysts and incident commanders who work around the clock, so they are uniquely qualified to help the APA quickly react to violations. Many GPS violations occur when an offender leaves in what's called an inclusion zone. Inclusion zone. That is a place where an ex-inmate is allowed to be, home or maybe work. It's also important to know when that person enters an exclusion zone, which is a prohibited area, like a victim's neighborhood. In some situations, particularly involving offenders who are homeless, exclusion zones can be hard to define. Now, the working group found that the APA doesn't always set exclusion zones for all offenders, leaving some to essentially go where they please. That changes now. Following a recommendation from this group, I've directed the APA to require inclusion and exclusion zones for each and every offender on post-release control. Further, I've ordered them to develop standardized exclusion zones targeted to particular types of offenders, such as sex offenders. Now, let me talk a little bit about high-risk versus low-risk offenders. At any given time, there are a number of low-risk offenders who, under current law, are subject to electronic monitoring. In 2018, 30% of people on electronic monitoring were considered low risk. Frankly, this limits our ability to monitor more dangerous offenders who have been convicted of violence or sex offenses, or who otherwise present a high risk to public safety. Part of the issue is a statutory requirement that mandates certain low-risk offenders to wear a GPS monitor, even though these are not the people who are highly likely to reoffend. This must change as well. I will be asking the General Assembly to amend this law and give the APA more flexibility to redirect these resources to those who are at higher risk to cause harm. It only makes good common sense. Now, finally, I believe it's time for Ohio to make better use of the post-release control GPS data we have to proactively solve and prevent crimes. I've ordered the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation, in partnership with my staff and in consultation with Innovate Ohio, to begin the process of mapping out a plan to bring crime scene correlation technology to this state. This technology would, as we envision it, allow law enforcement to input the address of a crime and then determine if someone on electronic monitoring was at the scene in that area when that crime occurred. We currently do not have the ability to do that. We do not have the technology to do it. Several states do. Ohio needs to do this, and I'm committed to making this happen. Law enforcement, if we did this, could use this tool, this investigative lead, to make an arrest before another crime happens. The working group thoroughly examined the pros and cons of a system like this and also considered a study mandated by the legislature into the feasibility of creating a crime scene correlation system. This group believes, as I do, that the potential to use this tool to stop an offender from committing a string of serious crimes is something we must explore and do. I believe this will save lives. Reagan Tokes, who I briefly mentioned earlier, was an Ohio State student who was brutally murdered in 2017. She was murdered by a man who was on post-release control and GPS monitoring. After that brutal homicide, investigators learned that the suspect, Brian Goldsby, was responsible for a string of armed robberies in the days before he took this young woman's life. The tool that I'm asking the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation to build in conjunction with public safety and would allow law enforcement to proactively and quickly determine if someone on GPS monitoring was involved in a crime before it turns into a crime spree, instead of after, when it's too late. Now, I want to be candid about our expectations. This is not going to be easy to do, and it's not going to happen overnight. This isn't something that we're going to be able to snap our fingers and make happen. But we have to start now. How long it will take and what it will cost, frankly, we don't know yet. We may need work to secure funding for this in the next biennium budget, but we're going to start studying it now and moving forward. We are in the very early stages of this process, but I am committed to making this happen. If it can stop one robbery from turning into another robbery and then into a murder, it's all worth it. Let me now turn it over to the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction Director, Annette Chambers-Smith, who will tell you more about some other actions that we are taking. Director, thank you. I'll get my papers out of your way and let you come up here. Thanks, Director.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you, Governor DeWine, for making this a priority. I feel that this is not something that we've had adequate funding to do, and you have secured additional funding for us, and we appreciate being able to make the changes that are associated with that funding. As you know, the vision of the Department of Rehabilitation and Correction is to reduce crime in Ohio. That's why we're here. We're fully committed to continuously improving to do this better. Just like Governor DeWine, I had concerns following the tragic death of Penelope Jasko and Eleanor McBride. It happened on my watch. Two young girls who had too little time on this earth. I wanted to know what my agency could do about it, and we began to work on it. After a thorough review of the case, we saw that there were policies that could change, and we started doing that. I also requested a review from the National Institute of Corrections because I wanted to get people from outside of Ohio who studied best practices all the time to come in and help us do strategic planning and get to be the best that we possibly could be. Before I talk about some of the items already in motion, I'd like to take a moment to try to just give people a grasp of the scope. The prisons hold about 49,000 people, and there's about 6,000 correction officers to manage 49,000 people. There's 34,000 people on supervision of the Adult Parole Authority, and there's less than 500 parole officers. And so I just wrapping my mind around doing the very best we can with people who are free to go wherever they want to. It's not an easy task, but it's one that we will put our shoulders to and do. Prior to the supervision and problems with Raymond Walters in that case, we had already started making changes based upon other cases. So I'm going to cover a little bit of that because some of it has nothing to do with what we're talking about with the work group, and I think it's important that we know some other things that are going on. So we are making changes to our administrative review policy. Currently it's triggered because I asked for a review. In the future, we're going to have more of a sentinel events review policy that will be triggered by the event itself, not someone specifically asking for a review. Something similar to a mortality morbidity review that gets conducted in a hospital. In addition, in Ohio, we use the Ohio Risk Assessment System, and some question was had about whether this is the appropriate system. So we did study different systems to assess risk, and discovered that the risk assessment system we're using is top-notch. However, it doesn't really predict violence. It's made to predict recidivism. And so we will be putting in place tools to predict violence, much like we use the static 99 to predict sex offender behavior already. We're overhauling our family guide so that we can make the families our partners and help us supervise the people that come out more effectively. We've already changed some after-hours protocols, but as the governor mentioned, we aren't funded, nor do we operate 24 hours a day. The supervisors get calls, and they take some actions, but not all the way up to getting a warrant. They don't have leads access, and they're not in the office. So our partnership with the Highway Patrol should lead to us being able to cover 24/7, 365. I've also signed off on a policy change that says that if you miss your drug testing appointment, it will be counted as a positive. That's not the way it was done in the past. That's the way it will be done in the future. Several other efforts are underway to focus risk in offenders that have risk behavior. Violations committed and warrants for high-risk individuals will be taken care of before and more quickly than, by policy, those that are low risk. Those under PRC supervision are found to have committed a violation that involves a weapon will automatically receive the maximum amount of prison time available. The conditions of supervision have been clarified to better protect victims. They now prohibit contact with anyone that has a protection order against the offender. In the past, we were looking at the instant offense, and there could have been other crimes permitted previously or while someone was on supervision in which a protection order was issued. That too now will be part of the supervision. The APA has also been working on enhancing the training that the parole officers are provided. In the past, they've received training that's basically similar to what a correction officer gets, and now there's an entire academy for new hired parole officers that's specific to them. The supervisors have been trained in a strategy that reinforces positive relationships between those who are being supervised and the supervisee, so that we can do a better job of helping them as well. We've sent all of our leadership of APA through core correctional practices, and that will be getting rolled out to all the parole officers. And there's a new electronic management system coming out for the cases that the parole officers do that's web-based and will allow them to document as they go. This should allow for a lot more documentation done much more quickly as opposed to doing it subsequently. Finally, last fall, I reached out to the NIC because I wanted to know as much as I could, and I discovered that ORAS is actually used in 25 states. So we have a system in Ohio that's used at every step along the way in law enforcement. It's not the system that's broken, but it needs things added to it. So the University of Cincinnati will be doing a study that will lead toward adding violence to the risk assessment. It's not present there now, and DRC is committed to finding an interim tool while UC does this work. I think the most important thing that I wanted to get across today is, yes, we talk about the mission of DRC being to reduce recidivism, but our mission is public safety.
Thanks, Director. Thanks very much. Director, thank you. I want to thank all the members of the working group and just say that, you know, their work, and I want to make it very clear, their work does not end with the issues of this report. Their work is going to continue, and we're going to rely upon them. We're going to rely upon them to continue to monitor what is going on and to make sure that things are moving in the right direction. They have other things that they're looking at, and so while we're going to follow the recommendations here, we're also going to look to this group for additional recommendations as we move forward. Just another comment about post-release control. It is a complex process. It is bound up by many laws that we have to follow and regulations. It's largely driven, of course, by unpredictable human behavior. The goal, and the director talked about the risk assessment, and I didn't talk about that, but I want to add something about that. The risk assessment is very, very important that we move to a risk assessment that is focused just not on recidivism itself, but is focused on propensity or possibility of violence. That is the key. Again, the safety of the public has to be the most important thing that we're doing. Let me just open up for questions.
Governor, I know that Raymond Walters was the impetus for creating this working group, but I know a few Ohio families who would say this wasn't the first tragedy and would wonder, why did so many people have to die before the state took action?
When I became governor and appointed the director, we started making changes. This working group came together with some very specific changes. This is certainly is imperfect system. I'm not blaming the change and going to determinate sentencing, but when you went to determinate sentencing, the ability to keep a person locked up in prison when they've been behaving poorly in prison, which we believe is a good predictor of the future, that went away, or it was dramatically lessened. So that is a problem. Some of it's been addressed by the legislature, but frankly, as we move forward, more of it has to be addressed.
What would you say to those families who've lost someone?
I would say to the families who've lost someone, and these are just horrible, horrible stories. What I would say is that I'm very, very sorry for their horrible loss. And there's nothing worse than losing a child.
Would any of the recommended changes would have made a difference in the Raymond Walters case?
I'll start off and say that anytime we make changes, one cannot predict, can't go back in time and say, would that have prevented a certain incident or a certain tragedy? I don't think anyone can say that. But what we can say is that all of the things in this report when implemented fully, will make Ohio a lot safer and will save lives. I think we know that. I don't know if anybody on the working group wants to jump in on that last question or not, but Reggie?
It's impossible to say that, lives can be, saved with recommendations alone. It's going to take training of staff. It's going to take a due diligence that I think we already have, but what we're suggesting here and with the recommendations is to intensify that. I've served on commissions for law enforcement and been involved with corrections for decades, and it's always in a perpetual stage of improvement. But the reality is we have some bad people who are going to do more bad things in the future. Our goal and the mission is to minimize that wherever we can and to prevent, further loss of life due to it being our fault. If it's not under our control and is something that we can't control directly, then there are going to be some other tragedies. Stuff happens sometimes, and it's not our mission to ignore it. The Department of Rehabilitation and Correction has something called an administrative review. When bad cases go wrong, they always take a microscope and look at exactly what happened in an attempt to prevent it from happening again. So, as the governor said, we sympathize with and feel bad for the losses of families in this state, and Ms. Paparaki represents victims of crime in Ohio, and she might have a comment. But that is our mission: public safety, public health, and to prevent further tragedies from happening when we can.
Anybody else?
As the victim representative on this work group, I don't think that it is, it doesn't ease the victims and the survivors' minds if we say that we couldn't have prevented it. The thing is that we just don't know that. But here on out, though, moving forward, I hope that the victims and survivors of those families can see our efforts and the state of Ohio's efforts and the governor's efforts in moving forward to where we can keep our communities safe, we can prevent loss of life, and furthermore prevent more trauma in our communities. So to those families and survivors who were the impetus for this work group, our apologies. I know that doesn't solve the problem and that doesn't bring your loved ones back, but please know that they're at the forefront, your families and your loved ones, and the public interest of the public safety is at the forefront of this report.
Governor, if the parole officer staffing issue is a problem now, if the fact that we don't have people working on weekends is a problem now, Why would we wait until the next budget?
Yeah, we're not waiting, for that part of it, we're not waiting at all. We're moving right directly to put a system together, and I know we covered a lot of ground, and it's sometimes a little confusing, but we're putting a system together. I've ordered the Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections, along with Public Safety, to work this out very, very quickly so that Department of Public Safety will be getting that information so they can input that immediately. And maybe someone, the colonel or somebody, could explain that. Thank you.
Thank
Just
you, Governor.
identify yourself on it.
Yes, I'm Captain Richard Zwyer. I'm with the Highway
Colonel,
Patrol.
I thought I was calling you Colonel.
That just gave me a promotion,
Promotion. So
Governor. Thank you. No, our hub, our fusion center is prepared and poised to assist the Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections and APA to assist them in the accountability portion of this, whereas we can help with our 24/7 center. We have a staff of analysts that are already working 24/7 as well to assist our watch desk commanders to have that accountability and to assist them in this tracking process. So we're fully prepared to assist them in any way with that, Governor.
So that will switch over, and so basically what it will mean is if this occurs on at night or it occurs, a person goes into an area they're not supposed to be in, that information can be immediately put in and action can be taken.
But what about the funding for the?
Yeah, the funding is for. Excuse me.
So we have 40 staff we're hiring now, and we're transitioning probation work back to the counties where it came from and providing funding for those counties to do the work themselves. That should be finished by June of this year. That will give us 60 more people that can work on the caseload. So during this year, through the transitions we're doing, during this biennium, there will be 100 additional parole officers. And I don't know that we can hire too many more people at one time and
When I saw the report, and what we talked about doing is to be very open and set out a plan so that it's not just a short-term plan, it's a long-term plan. And so, you know, I wanted to signal to the General Assembly that to continue this plan and to continue to adding parole officers, frankly, we're going to have more money. And so that money we would hope would come in the next biennium. But as the director indicated, we're going to continue we will be continuing to move up like that. But to continue that into the next biennium, we're going to have more money, and that's just the way it is. And governing is about setting priorities, and safety of the public is certainly a high priority.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't 50-to-1 ratio already the goal of the adult parole authority?
I don't know.
it was a goal, but a goal without funding isn't going to get you any staff.
Governor, if the goals are...
So again, let me just add one thing. Again, one of the themes you'll see through this report is let's constantly try to apply the resources that we have. First of all, we need to grow the resources, but let's constantly try to make the decision of where those resources are applied based on who's the most dangerous. Now, you're not always going to be right, but they can have a pretty good idea. And so, you know, eliminating the monitoring for people who are out for just a very short period of time, and it was added by the legislature with good intentions, but we need to free those people up so we have a better ratio with the ones who are more dangerous.
The goal here is public safety, essentially the absence of crime. What does success look like here in your future? How do you assess that to make sure this is
Look, you can never determine what your actions have done to prevent a crime that doesn't occur. And so, you know, I'm not sure that it can be perfectly measured, but the goal should be to constantly examine the system to determine what changes need to be made. And back to the point that was made earlier in the question, you know, this should be a process that is continuous, and we should not wait until the next tragedy. And the way we will do that is that this working group is going to continue their work. And the department is itself going to continue to examine what it does. But it's not just good enough to have the department. We need other people outside looking at this, victims' representatives, someone like Reggie Wilkinson, who ran this department for many, many years. So we need that outside expertise and that outside help to constantly monitor and to see what else we can do to protect the public. So it is a process. I don't know any other way to do it besides a process.
Governor, one of the tools that the department has added to its tool belt to help sort of relieve that pressure on parole officers is to add new technology, including telephone reporting. Last month we reported that there was a person assigned to that program who's charged with homicide.
Yeah, I've asked the group to examine that. And that is one of the things that they're going to examine. Again, it's a continuing process, and when we get good reporting and information that comes out raised in the media, they're going to take a look at it. They're going to take a look at it, and by talking internally as well. But however that information flows to them, this working group will continue, and this working group will look at things like that. So yes, I was concerned by that story. They're going to look at. They're going to come back with a recommendation.
Do you believe in your heart of hearts that violent offenders should be assigned to that type of reporting, where it reduces face-to-face interaction?
Well, my first reaction is probably no. You know, it would seem to me that would be, but I'm going to let the people who are the experts and who have a lot more experience in this than I do, but my first reaction would be no. Look, I'm the old prosecutor. I'm someone who thinks that, you know, we have to constantly focus on repeat violent offenders and people who are sex offenders. And these people, frankly, aren't spending enough time in prison. And, you know, again, when the legislature made the change 20 years ago to determinate sentencing, it was made with all good intentions, and it was made in reaction to the public's belief that, hey, somebody gets a 10 to 20 and they end up out in 3 years, and what does that mean? So it was, quote, called truth in sentencing. But one of the things that we have learned is that with that, we lose the ability for the prison to control that person when they're in prison, and we know that their actions in prison are one good indicator of what they will do or not do when they get out. And so again, I think the legislature we have to constantly be looking at this and you know, maybe come up with a system on a lot of different offenses where you've got determinate sentencing, guaranteed so many years, but at the same time you put an indeterminate side onto it so that there's a tail on it. So that, you know, again, that's work that has to be done in the legislature, and we'll be very interested in that.
You threw a lot at us this morning. I'm wondering, a lot of that is going to cost money. Are there changes being implemented that you believe could have been done before this working group was created? The things that should have been part of the process that weren't?
Look, I'm not, you know, when you come up with recommendations and ideas, you always can say they should have been done. And so I'm trying to get ahead of this with the issue that's probably going to take a couple years, but, you know, we have an obligation to use technology to protect the public. I think too often we're behind in law enforcement, and we're behind in corrections and parole in the use of technology. And these cases kind of brought that out. Technology is only as good as how we use it. And in the case of being able to see, when I've started them down this path today and said there should be a sense of urgency, and we should really be working on this now to figure out how we do it, because there's a couple states I'm told are doing it. But the ability to say if someone, you know, leaves where they're the zone, they're on electronic monitoring, and being able to find them near a crime scene, that is something that theoretically we have the technology to do. We just have to implement it and start down that pathway. So the point is, you've got to get in front of this stuff, and that's what we're trying to do.
Are we going to take one more question?
Governor, you're talking about needing some legislative changes. We've already got the Reagan-Tokes Act Part 2 pending out there that would do some of this. Why not just move that forward?
Why not what?
Why not just move that forward, move that bill, rather than wait until next budget, etc.?
Okay, I'm not quite sure. We have the Reagan-Tokes Act. But what I just said is futuristic. As we look down, I have concerns that we need to expand that. And, you know, again, this is a discussion that we have to have with the legislature and members of the Judiciary Committee and others, but it seems to me that one of the problems we have had is the inability to make how that person behaves in prison, which is a good predictor, to be able to use that to extend their period of time. We can't legally extend their period of time, so we've got to have it on the books and somehow to pull back. So I just think that's the trend. I hope the legislature continues to look at that and to expand Reagan-Tokes. That's all I'm saying about that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. Mr. Record.